Welcome back to another indigo-hued episode of What Happened, the show that deep dives into games, movies, and consoles that absolutely went through it. And out of the many pieces of hardware that Nintendo has released over the decades, their plucky lunchbox-shaped machine is certainly one such console. While looked back upon much more fondly nowadays, Nintendo's 6th generation contender had been seen by many as a bit of a joke at the time for a variety of reasons, and no amount of celebrities awkwardly holding the machine was going to change that. So, grab the nearest handle, whatever's at arm's reach, and turn your Wavebirds to channel 3 or, 4? Wait a minute. Okay, there. As I answer the question, what happened to the Nintendo GameCube? It's a pretty well-known fact, but the Big N gave up a lot of market share a lot of quickly during its battle with the original PlayStation. Sony's machine beat the N64 to market by almost 2 years, and was able to move a staggering 102 million consoles through the late 90s and early 2000s, via its contemporary marketing campaigns, a perfect read on the future being disc-based, which led to massive third-party support and, just being the cool new kid on the block. Meanwhile, the Nintendo Ultra 64 put a lot of emphasis on multiplayer fun via its native 4-player support and a smaller, but nonetheless still stellar, selection of exclusives developed mainly by Rare and Nintendo's own internal teams. Despite providing radically different gameplay experiences from what was available on the SNES and laying the groundwork for so many 3D gameplay conventions, the N64 sold a good deal less than its 16-bit predecessor, 32.9 million consoles against 49.1. Now, the Game Boy line was doing incredibly well, but still, Nintendo's piece of the overall video game pie was getting smaller and smaller, so they were well aware they were going to have to seriously address their missteps if they wanted to keep, existing in the home console space. By far, the biggest of these missteps was their continued commitment to cartridges. Aside from certain technical advantages like faster data read speeds and more durability compared to the oh-so-scratchable 90s era CD, the lower storage capacity and the high manufacturing costs of cartridges unfortunately ostracized Nintendo from third-party support in an era where developers were itching to implement CD-quality soundtracks, tons of voice acting, and elaborate CGI cutscenes. And of course, cheesy FMVs that I still love. To put it all in perspective on just how bad this problem became, the N64's other main competitor, the Sega Saturn, which despite selling far worse, had seen over 1,000 games ship worldwide, which more than doubled the N64's back catalog, which sits at just under 400. Now, if I could again pull up the PS1 sales figures. Oh, okay, yeah, you get the picture. So when Nintendo began designing their next machine, carts were gone from like second one, but of course this big decision had to be done in the most Nintendo way possible. Instead of going with a standard or expected format, they went with their own proprietary mini discs, which offered more space than traditional CD-ROMs, but still lagged behind the storage capacity of the forthcoming DVD by what most tech journalists and industry vets described as a huge shitload. GameCube game discs could hold roughly 1.4 gigs, while the DVD could easily house a girthy 4.7, with later DVD types taking on even heavier loads. I mean, you do the math. Why did Nintendo do this? Well, they reportedly didn't have a whole lot of faith in the DVD format as a whole, just like they did for CD-ROMs the previous generation, didn't want to pay the licensing fees for the technology, and, most importantly of all, they were terrified of the piracy that had been rampant in the CD space. Even though this decision would generate a lot of long-term negative effects elsewhere down the line, it can't be denied that proprietary discs were indeed a good solution to all those pesky piracy problems. To make all of this happen though, Nintendo naturally needed to seek outside help, so the optical drive was designed by Panasonic, as Nintendo R&D had very little experience in this field. After a failed chipset venture with Samsung, Nintendo then partnered with up-and-coming graphics company ArtX, who were made up of former designers from Silicon Graphics, who had worked closely with Nintendo on who would then begin working on their new Flipper chipset to power Nintendo's new machine. Flipper provided the backbone of the console's graphical capabilities, and even led to the Dolphin codename the GameCube went by for a few years. Nintendo felt this new chipset would give them the edge they needed, as Flipper was more powerful and versatile than the competition, and cheap to produce to boot. Nintendo engineers knew it was superior to what was in the Dreamcast, and they were confident it would easily outclass whatever Sony could throw at them next. Kenichiro Ashida led the hardware design for the GameCube, and he and his team worked tirelessly to deliver a form factor that was visually friendly and particularly compact, inspired largely by the small size of the GameCube discs themselves. The masterstroke of the design, however, was of course the handle. During the team's research process, they found that a lot of 1990s-era gamers regularly move their consoles around to find their ideal play positions, given that most controllers were still wired at the time. Ashida also regarded the handle as an overall aesthetic plus, helping to lend the console an even more friendly appearance. Miyamoto and his team, meanwhile, spent a long time in secret developing the GameCube's controller, abandoning many ambitious prototypes and other wild ideas until they honed in on something that was both comfortable and functional, while still having those oh-so-distinct Nintendo eccentricities. While things were starting to come together, Nintendo grabbed Martin Hollis, the director of GoldenEye, who at that time had just quit from his position at Rare and was in the middle of a vacation. Nintendo quickly sold him on an advisory job at Nintendo Technology Development, where he worked for about 6 months, helping and advising Nintendo's designers, marketers, engineers, and even Miyamoto himself on the console, its features, architecture, the whole 9 yards. Hollis would eventually suggest the name StarCube, which Nintendo would actually go on to copyright as a potential name, although it obviously got tweaked in the end. In an interview on Video Games Chronicle, Hollis humbly admits that he doesn't know for sure if his initial suggestion led to the word cube being used, or if someone else within the company had come up with it on their own. In that same article, Hollis also explained how the overall design and look of the GameCube came to be, and how Nintendo was looking to position it. The size and the price go together pretty much. As you optimize on cost, you optimize on the space as well. That was Nintendo's concept from the start. They had this idea that they wanted a small machine. Although they weren't explicit about this in public, they didn't want to compete on performance or be seen using numbers like polygons in a kind of marketing battle. The GameCube's design was complete by early 2000, with the initial plan actually to release it during the holiday season of that year to go toe-to-toe with the PS2 and prevent Sony from taking advantage of another year-long head start that they had with the original PlayStation. Obviously, that did not happen, due to that really pesky problem of games not even being close to finished. The second man in charge of Nintendo at that time, Hiroshi Imanishi, even kind of threw the software teams under the bus a bit in an old article on ZDNet. We are targeting a December launch before the Japanese Christmas season, but we have to take many things into consideration for political and strategic reasons, so we just cannot tell if the Japanese launch is 100% sure or not. It's always the case with Nintendo. The hardware is already completed, but the software is not. Eventually, Nintendo relented, choosing to delay the console's launch all the way to September of 2001 in Japan, November of 2001 in North America, and March of 2002 for Europe. for the very competitive price of $199 US, $100 less than the competition. Regardless, Sony was still getting that head start completely unopposed. Sorry Dreamcast, an advantage that Miyamoto tried to wave off by claiming that the GameCube software would be so irresistible and superior that it will become the requisite for everyone, even though they already have the PS2. This was a fancy way of saying that even if people shelled out $299 for Sony's machine, eventually they would all have to buy the GameCube. It was just a matter of time. No, it wasn't. A lot of noise was made about the GameCube's default color scheme, which, even well into its life cycle and having seen a good number of other color options, was a critique it could never really shake. Before launch, Nintendo of America's marketing team were called in to give their input on what would ship to store shelves, input which would largely be ignored. Revisiting that same VGC article from earlier, Nintendo's former VP of Marketing, Perrin Kaplan, stated, "We were called in to rate which colors we liked. There must have been 30 GameCube box samples in there, and the colors range from poopy brown to crazy and striking prime colors. I remember some were these dark yellow, almost skin tone-like colors, and we were like, you cannot launch that, it's so unattractive." Japanese leadership were pretty insistent on purple, or more accurately, indigo, as the default color, but Nintendo of America thought otherwise. We actually suggested that the purple was not the best to start with, and Japan said, no, we're going to use that. Then we pushed for black and silver because I think in the US, nobody had ever really done the purple color before. It wasn't that you couldn't bring out hardware that was a different color, it was just a very female-looking color. It just didn't feel masculine, I think. I remember us being very nervous at E3 that we were going to get bad press purely based on the color. Which they did! While it seems silly nowadays, as expressing oneself via customization and multiple options is like a really reasonable thing, but the early 2000s were a pretty different time. Anyway, after appearing at both the 2001 E3 and Space World shows, the GameCube released in Japan on September 14, 2001, with approximately 500,000 consoles shipped to stores. Around that same time, Nintendo of America were originally scheduled to hold an early star-studded pre-launch event, but they obviously decided to delay that a little bit until October, cause yeah, I think the vibe would have been a little off if these now legendary photos had been taken immediately under the shadow of 9/11. The November 18th North American launch of the GameCube went relatively well, but it can't be denied that it lacked the killer app that Nintendo's previous consoles had all enjoyed. Absolutely no disrespect to it, but Luigi vacuuming up a storm in a haunted mansion didn't quite have the same impact as his brother swinging Bowser around in 3D for the very first time. Fortunately, Luigi wasn't alone, as he was also backed up by Ryoto Hayami and Luke Skywalker. Wave Race Blue Storm's gorgeous water effects and Rogue Leader's stunning everything made for an incredibly solid exclusive trio, with Miyamoto's charming Pikmin hitting store shelves less than a month later. All four were financial successes, but if you craned your neck just a bit to the side, you'd be able to see Final Fantasy X in its natural habitat, as it absolutely crushed everything at retail that same month. Miyamoto's wild theory about PS2 users jumping aboard GameCube looked all the wilder as the days passed. As far as other key titles went, new Mario, Zelda, and Metroid titles were still about a year away, and their absence absolutely hurt the Cube's very important first holiday season and first year on the market. Thankfully, there was one little understated release which sprang up about a month after launch to help the GameCube ship weather these early rough waters. Melee would wind up being arguably the GameCube's most important game, selling over 600,000 units across its first few weeks in Japan and North America combined, and continuing to sell well and consistently over the course of the console's entire lifecycle, clearing 7 million units until the Cube was eventually retired. While it remains the console's most successful title financially, smashing and/or wave dashing didn't pry away the millions and millions more who were all glued to their PS2s or Xboxes. In fact, no matter the game, price drop, or marketing tactic, that was something Nintendo would never be able to do. That demographic, the fabled hardcore gamer, was the main group the GameCube regularly tried targeting and failed to attract, even when Nintendo made a lot of big money moves to try to do just that. I went pretty in depth on this in my Resident Evil 4 video, but Nintendo snagging RE exclusivity for a number of years was an incredibly lucky break, and while it produced some great games, Capcom shareholders were disappointed at the lackluster sales in comparison to the earlier PlayStation entries. This concern bled over into the once GameCube exclusive Capcom 5 or 4, which all got PS2 ports, sometimes with extra content, except for my beloved PN03, of course. Eternal Darkness, a psychological survival horror gem that Nintendo funded and published, despite its very strong critical reception, failed to sell even 500,000 copies, at least according to a claim by Eurogamer. Then, when Nintendo announced they had secured an exclusive remake of Metal Gear Solid, there was much rejoicing from the GameCube faithful, before the Twin Snakes would reportedly post some of the lowest sales figures of the entire franchise. I tried and failed to find concrete numbers for North America and Europe, but in Japan, it shifted only 71,000 copies in total. According to NPD group numbers archived in various places, Twin Snakes sold over 148,000 units in its first 2 months on sale in North America, while in Japan, it shifted only 71,000 copies across its entire life. So it's very possible that it never even broke 300K, a depressingly low bar for a series as revered as Metal Gear. Mature rated and third-party content rarely, if ever, sold blockbuster numbers on the GameCube, something that IDOS CEO Mike McGarvey pointed out when his company announced they were abandoning support for the Cube as early as 2003. The GameCube is a declining business. If other companies follow us, Nintendo will have a hard battle to fight. Can you imagine how bad things must be going when third parties start recommending that other third parties stop supporting you? After that, IDOS only shipped 3 titles on the GameCube by development teams who already had them in the pipeline, while PS2 and Xbox saw over 20 IDOS published games released within that same time period. The slumping sales numbers were publicly waved away by Nintendo higher-ups, though in a rare bit of transparency, Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi went so far as to theorize that the massive disparity between the Cube and its competition was due to the popularity of violent games on other consoles, implicitly acknowledging that titles like Grand Theft Auto were far and away the biggest success story of the 6th generation. There were some extremely vague rumors that Rockstar had been planning to bring GTA to the GameCube in some form, but those seemed to be pretty unsubstantiated. Aside from their lone Cube title, Smuggler's Run Warzones, the GameCube evidently failed to rizz up Rockstar, as the kids would say. The same story played out for a number of other publishers and franchises, where both the Xbox or PS2 saw some fairly big releases that just skipped the Cube altogether. The Suffering, Blood Rain 2, Psyops, The Punisher, Max Payne, Silent Hill, Castlevania, Contra, King of Fighters, Onimusha, Fatal Frame, the list goes on and on. While it's true Nintendo burned a few bridges during the life of the N64, the relationship with third parties was at an all-time low, being only perhaps by the woeful final years of the Wii U. Nintendo's play for the core audience had completely whiffed, and everyone knew it. The Lunchbox's troubles came to a head when, at the start of 2003, Nintendo actually had to halt the console's entire production line to save money from overstocking warehouses with unsold machines. For around 9 months, no new cubes were manufactured, the polar opposite of what you usually see from major hardware launches. Once production picked back up again in September, Nintendo smartly dropped the price of the Cube down to $99, the same MSRP as the Game Boy Advance. I ain't gonna front though, that's a pretty fire deal. This coincided with the 2003 holiday shopping season, which did provide a nice boost in sales, but it wasn't momentum that was retained. Now, while it's been a good bit of gloom and doom up to this point, keep in mind, for the majority of the console's life, it was actually profitable for Nintendo. This was due to their aggressive cost-saving measures, which we've already touched on. No DVD drive, proprietary discs, and the inexpensive custom flipper chipset. Regardless of the bump, the PS2 would still firmly remain the market leader, and realistically, there was no way Nintendo would ever catch up. The GameCube's design and Nintendo's philosophy behind it was locked in, mostly due to Hiroshi Yamauchi's extremely strict management style. Nowadays, if Nintendo of America pushed back against something, there's a decent chance plans could change, but not during the iron reign of Yamauchi. While he stepped down from his position as Nintendo president 6 months into the GameCube's life, it was too late to pivot from the course. Launch was a bust, all of Nintendo's internal teams were already committed to their projects, and only so much course correction could realistically be done by the new president, the late great Satoru Iwata. During all of this, the Game Boy Advance was the one big bright spot for Nintendo, selling over 81 million units throughout its life, where it operated with next to no competition. It was a huge success that Nintendo hoped to capitalize on in a few different ways with the GameCube. GBA to Cube connectivity was touted as the main selling point for releases like Four Swords Adventures, Animal Crossing, and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, along with full compatibility with the entire Game Boy lineage via the Game Boy Player. These were fairly novel features, but if the goal was to get new butts and seats, they maybe weren't as flashy or as sexy as Nintendo thought they were. Simply put, the GameCube lacked the X factor it desperately needed to break out and appeal to the non- or lapsed Nintendo fan. Yeah, you could easily carry the console around, but unlike the PS2 or Xbox, which allowed DVD and CD playback and online multiplayer, something the GameCube completely lacked. Almost completely lacked. Functionality and feature-wise, the Cube didn't offer much more than the N64 did, unless you were a massive Game Boy Chad who demanded their handheld experiences must be on console. It was admirable that Nintendo stuck to their guns by delivering a pure, dedicated video game system, but technology and trends were rapidly changing around this time, and the bets they placed on the Cube's features were obviously not panning out. Even big innovations like the ever-wonderful Wavebird controller were somewhat muted, as it wasn't there at launch or was made the standard for the console as the pack-in. If it had, Nintendo might have been able to levy it as even the slightest edge over the competition, although that still probably wouldn't have moved the needle all that much. This was a sentiment shared by Martin Hollis, who, if you recall, helped Nintendo with the Cube's overall design. In order for a console to win, you need to do everything right, and then you need to have one more thing, a killer feature that nobody else has. Nintendo had suffered quite a punishing defeat with the N64. They made nice money, but they lost the majority market share, and the reason was because they didn't have a CD drive. Really, it's as simple as that. So that's something they got right on GameCube, and it was also a lovely machine to develop for, but that wasn't enough. It didn't have that one more thing. It didn't have a gimmick, a secret weapon, or that one sizable feature that nobody else had. The handle and the idea of carrying it from house to house, I think, could have been great, but we just couldn't think of a way to make that a big deal. I never really felt like we made a success out of the handle. It was just nice to have, and that's it. As we are winding down, I will take a minute to talk about one aspect of the GameCube that Nintendo had apparently poured a bunch of money into that, unfortunately, never even released. An official 3D LCD screen add-on. Yes, more than a decade before the 3DS would hit shelves, Nintendo was fist deep into making their cubic console even more three-dimensional. For many years, this information has mostly been forgotten, but recent developments have brought some new info to light. In an Iwata Asks article on the subject of the Nintendo 3DS, Iwata shared that the GameCube actually has the necessary hardware to display 3D images, even sharing that they had a version of Luigi's Mansion that played out in full 3D directly on the GameCube hardware, and that the LCD screen that they had showed off at E3 2002 actually secretly supported this feature. Wait, Nintendo showed this thing off? Yes, although E3 2002 was just before everything went digital, so video or images of the device are extremely rare. Iwata also revealed that Miyamoto and future criminal Yuji Naka collaborated on a version of Phantasy Star Online 3 that allowed for two GameCubes to be hooked up, and using the LCD screen attachment would allow users to enjoy card battles without being able to see each other's hands. Ultimately, what sealed the add-on's fate was, of course, the price, as Nintendo never found a way to make it affordable, which was kind of the point of the GameCube. If the screen had been released and Yuji Naka and Miyamoto's PSO3 collab had been a blockbuster, things might have been very different, although on second thought, this might have messed with Naka's recent canon event. These expensive/unreleased innovations, and with coming in third in home console sales during the entire generation aside, Perrin Kaplan looked back on this time at Nintendo with a positive outlook. With GameCube, we made money and it was profitable, and that's something I think is sometimes really missed by the public. The others were bleeding, and we were still profitable. One of the challenges that we always had with GameCube is that Nintendo has always been an incredibly profitable company, and we saw ourselves as different from Microsoft and Sony, but externally, we would still be judged in a lineup. But it was the popularity of the GBA, a platform that was still offering comparatively simple games, which gave way to the Nintendo DS, which proved to be fairly successful during its initial 2005 launch, before the clean, sleek lines of the DS Lite really pushed the hardware into the stratosphere. It's quite possible that the GameCube's lack of meaningful innovations led directly into the DS being arguably the most different thing released at that time, clearly paving its own way forward with a variety of unique features. Nintendo actually looked back to an earlier GameCube controller prototype and decided that it would be that X factor, that killer new feature that they would entirely base their next home console around. At the same time as GameCube, Nintendo was secretly working on a revolutionary controller sensor idea that was very time-consuming work that ultimately never got filtered into our GameCube development, but after several years this did produce the Wii Remote. The Wii is essentially a GameCube with some numbers doubled, but in a different colored box. But it's the Wii Remote that brought the extra thing that won Nintendo the market. That's how fine the margins are sometimes. Satoru Iwata had told investors to expect the GameCube to sell 50 million consoles by March of 2005, and while we can all appreciate the man's legendary positivity, he was a little off on that estimate. By the time the console was discontinued in 2007, it had moved 21 million units, placing it firmly below the N64, where it would remain until eventually being bested by the Wazoo.
Hey y'all!
These plummeting sales were ultimately the thing that lit a massive fire under Nintendo's red racetrack ass and got them to refocus their vision on where they thought the industry should head. They put all their bets on the Wii and its motion controller, and while it still couldn't dethrone Sony's original PlayStation in terms of worldwide sales numbers, the Wii came pretty damn close. But many Nintendo fans still hold the GameCube incredibly near and dear to their hearts, whether Whether it's the legions of Melee players who still use actual hardware for tournament setups, the psychos who salivate at the mention of custom Robo or Kirby Air Ride, or the litany of players who discover the console through the incredible Dolphin emulator, the GameCube is still more than just a fond memory for many a gamer. While it's been a bit of a bumpy ride since then, it's unmistakable that the many mistakes of the GameCube are an indelible part of what made Nintendo into the company it is today. So, good job, you weird geometric-shaped indigo son of a bitch! If you know of any other games, movies, or consoles that had a weird or confusing development journey, do let me know in the comments below or over on my Twitter. A really good example of one such project would be Star Fox Grand Prix, a long-rumored but never confirmed entry in the series allegedly developed by Retro Studios. If you head on over to Did You Know Gaming and check out their news video, which I narrated, you'll find out if this space animal racing game actually existed at some point. Link in the description and in the pinned comment below. See you next time, and thanks for watching!